Hello and welcome to the Discover Dayton podcast, the show that's all about the Gem City's past, present, and future. Today is another history episode, and I'm excited because I get to talk to Dayton writer Andrew Walsh. Andrew is an author, researcher, and academic librarian at Sinclair Community College. Andrew's book, Lost Dayton, was published in 2018, and he writes about historical and current Dayton topics on his website, DaytonVistas.com. So stay tuned for an interesting interview as we talk about 3 historic neighborhoods in Dayton, one of which no longer exists. So stay tuned. Hi, Andrew. Welcome to the show, and thanks for coming on today.
Thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, before we get to your book, I wanted to acknowledge that we both work at Sinclair Community College, which is where my wife actually just started a new job as well. So can you talk a little bit about you maybe and what you do at Sinclair for your day job?
Yeah, so I'm a librarian at Sinclair, which means the biggest part of my job is teaching students research skills. So stuff like how to find, evaluate, and use all types of sources for papers or other types of projects. So I really enjoy that work. Aside from the really kind of core library stuff, I also just work a lot with some college-wide initiatives like textbook affordability, increasing student success. So it's a really great place to be. And it was also my Sinclair job, which originally brought me to Dayton in 2013, which was what soon sparked my interest in all these historical topics that we'll be talking about today.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, speaking of that, to start off, your book is called Lost Dayton, and in it you research what different locations used to look like versus what was there now or not there in some cases. So in your very first chapter, you talk about a great example of that being Bomberger Park in St. Anne's Hill. Now it's pretty much just an open space, but could you describe what it would have looked like 100 years ago?
Yeah, so that part of town is actually the one that fascinated me the most when I first moved to Dayton, because I lived just down the street from Bomberger Park in the Dayton Towers apartment complex. So I could see that empty grassy space you mentioned right next to my building. Then there was really wide and busy Kiwi Street, and then more open space on the other side too. So that was all nestled in between two really historic, well-preserved neighborhoods, however, the Oregon District and St. Anne's Hill. So I was really confused and then really fascinated to find more about how that interesting development pattern would have come to be here in Dayton. So my initial research revealed that area encompassing my apartment building, Bomberger Park, and a lot of that open space was originally called the Haymarket neighborhood, which was a small, really dense area. Architecture looked very similar to the Oregon District. Had winding streets kind of through that whole area that's now all empty space, really beautiful homes, and then also things like corner stores for residents to get their daily necessities, and even lots of places to work. So there were even factories all kind of in that mixed use area.
Oh, wow. Well, speaking of the Haymarket district, there's at least one famous Daytonian I know of who was born there, but it's kind of hard to find his birthplace today due to the urban renewal that took place. But can you talk about Paul Laurence Dunbar and why it's difficult today to find out where his home would have been?
What's really interesting about that is that we do have a Paul Laurence Dunbar home on the near west side of town, which is a local landmark and museum. But that house, he only lived in for 2 years near the end of his life with his mother. So he was actually born in the Haymarket, as you mentioned. But the Haymarket, as you can sort of guess from my previous answer, is one of the most fully realized examples of urban renewal that was really completely razed to the ground. And it's a fascinating story, sort of how that came to be, which is relevant not just to Dayton, but really any American city around this time. So the 30s, 40s, and 50s, really any small to mid-sized to very large American city was kind of wondering what to do with these urban neighborhoods that they thought were declining, unsanitary, too crowded, but were ideally located near downtown areas. So city planners and other stakeholders had these major visions of leveling all these old cramped buildings in favor of new modern architecture with towers and green spaces. And it would all be totally built around the car, which was much different from how people had lived previous to that, walking, taking transit, streetcars, things like that. And
Sure.
For the very first time around then, a lot of federal money became available, and Dayton targeted the Haymarket neighborhood for that type of urban renewal. And I think it's especially important to remember that in these cases, those neighborhoods were largely working class, populated by minorities, immigrants, groups that really had little political power to fight back. So this was kind of where these speculative projects happened. These was where the highways were kind of rammed through dense areas. And to get back to Dunbar, his home was on a street that was basically right behind where there is a small surviving pocket of buildings. So if you know where Wheat Penny is, and then on the other side of Wayne Ave, where you have Rez's coffee shop and some other buildings, it was basically in that back parking lot behind one of the buildings next to Rez's, if I'm not mistaken. So an area that you would never guess today, had been homes, and definitely no indication that it was the birthplace of such a famous Daytonian.
Right. No, that's really interesting. Well, one person that I had on recently to talk about some other famous Daytonians was Angie Hoschauer from Woodland Cemetery. She mentioned Lib Hedges, who's buried at Woodland. And you said in your book she was known as the queen of Dayton's madams. And some people might be surprised to learn that Dayton had a red light district, though, in the Haymarket neighborhood. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I did say the neighborhood was mixed use, so it really had all types of uses, and that happened to be one of them, the main red light district in town. So that area centered on Pearl Street, which ran from 5th Street to Wayne Ave, and from what I found, there were no less than 38 brothels on that street, and many were these beautiful large brick Victorian residences. And Lib Hedges was born in Germany as Elizabeth Richter, and then she later came to Dayton and sort of started small with a small business. I believe she was downtown at first, and then grew to really run that whole show. She was also known as the Gem of Pearl Street, and despite kind of the purpose and potential reputation of an area like that, it was actually pretty well regarded around town from what I read. I had one source saying, while admittedly it was the most sinful spot in town, it was generally a cheery place. So that sort of sums it up from what I could tell.
That's funny. Well, moving westward a bit, you've already mentioned the Oregon District a little bit. You have an entire chapter on the Oregon District, which I'm sure all Daytonians will know about now, but they may not know that it was also nearly wiped out by urban renewal as well. So can you start off by maybe talking about, what the homes were like there, why they have, so much German influence?
Yeah, you're right that there definitely is a German influence. And the major reason for that is connected to really the major reason that the neighborhood developed when and where it did. So we kind of start in 1829 when the Miami and Erie Canal opened and ran down what is now Patterson Boulevard. So coming through sort of south downtown, it was really at the edge of today's Oregon District, just as the Patterson Boulevard is. So lots of industry naturally sprang up there next to the canal. And the Germans were one ethnic group who came by canal boat to take some of these new jobs. And we're not really talking about ethnic enclaves really the size of, say, Cincinnati with over the Rhine, but still significant communities. And you can see a lot of the influence. For example, several of the churches built in the neighborhood were originally German. And then, as you mentioned, the homes. One thing that I think is so cool about the Oregon District is there's such a wide variety of home types. And some of the earliest ones were these very modest homes for workers. They had just started a new life and got a job, maybe got some land, and were very frugal in their building of those homes using styles they knew from their homelands. So in those cases, there's some German influence there from those laborers essentially working near the canal. And it's interesting to sort of juxtapose that with some of the other streets very close in the neighborhood, where later in the 1800s, some of the business owners and people who got rich from Dayton's booming industry were building these essentially ornate mansions. So Jackson Street is one where you see quite a few large houses. You have a few others there, and many times they're right next to a much more modest home. So it's interesting to see some of that variety and to see that there were all types of residents in that area from the very beginning.
Oh, that's really cool. Well, and one thing I really like about your book a lot is how you talk about some of these places that Daytonians visit still to this day a lot, and they've now been repurposed. And there's a lot of those, in the Oregon district. And perhaps like just for, a few of them, could you talk about what some of these places like Salar's Restaurant or BRIM, the hat store, or Bonnets Bookstore used to be?
Definitely. The Oregon district is really the place in Dayton where we see the largest collection of these early buildings that still survive. And that's both homes in the neighborhood and then also in commercial buildings like the examples you mentioned. So BRIM is one that I talk about in the book quite a bit. And that was the site of the Baker's Hardware Store, which was the oldest continually operating storefront anywhere in Dayton from 1850 all the way up to 1962. And it really represents that type of family business that was really common during those years. Up and down Fifth Street and in many other commercial streets of Dayton as well. And if you look at the building today, if you look at it closely, you'll notice that there's really only half of it left. The other half collapsed due to neglect in the 1970s when the whole area was neglected as well. But I think it's great that they at least were able to save half of it. And I kind of use that actually in my book as sort of a symbol of the Oregon district, as that it was also in a very precarious state and was, chipped away and there was some danger it may all be lost, but of course, Oregon district was able to be saved. Talking about Salar, which you mentioned, that was originally a drugstore. That also dates back to the early 1850s. That structure, I believe, if you look closely at that one, I think the part closest to Brown Street and Fifth was originally more of like a smaller corner store, and then it was added onto. You can sort of see some of the differences in the facade. Bonnets Bookstore is one of the most beautiful facades in Dayton, in my opinion. It's a Romanesque revival architecture built in 1891. It was originally called the Ware Block for Charles Ware, who was a tea and coffee dealer. So it was kind of like wholesale coffee and tea in that location. And then interestingly, Bonnets itself has a really long history. So according to one article I found, it actually dates all the way back to 1939. So wow. Really cool to have a business with that much history that is actually still operating in town. So definitely the kind of small independent business that I think is really important to support.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Well, there's a story in your book that I find really fascinating because I love playing trivia every week at the Oregon Express, but that building that's there could have easily been leveled back in 1918 by this freak accident. Can you tell the story of the runaway flat cars?
Yeah, so that's another of those just really interesting episodes that there's a great photo of it that I do have in the book. And it was basically two flat cars were I believe hauling streetcar rail all the way down by Oakwood Ave near the University of Dayton. And then they somehow lost control and hurtled all the way down the hill in the sort of Oakwood Dayton border, and then kept going all the way into the Oregon district, kind of out of control. And they jumped the curb and crashed into all the buildings that are now about where Lily's restaurant is. And fortunately, from what I heard, no one was killed or seriously injured. But as you say, it definitely could have caused a lot more damage and destruction. I believe some of the buildings there that were hit, that probably kind of caused their demise. And if you look there, that side of Fifth Street, sort of where Lily's is, there's not as well preserved as far as the earliest buildings there. And I know some of that was due to the track elevation. So that's where you see the train tracks going over Fifth Street. They did that, I believe, around like 1930, and they knocked down a lot of buildings to do that. And then, of course, getting hit by runaway flat cars isn't going to help either. So that's an area where you do see slightly more recent buildings. But as you say, the Oregon Express is another beautiful old structure, and Salar building is still there. So I think that's positive. And then the other thing about that episode that really interests me is that it shows some of that major kind of urban renewal and transformation that has happened. So if you kind of are thinking about what I said as far as the path, it really doesn't make sense today because we have 35, we have the highway right behind, a couple blocks down Brown Street, sort of cutting off the Oregon District. But in the earlier days before highway construction, Brown Street was one of the biggest thoroughfares of the city, and it was a major entryway into the Oregon District. So it went uninterrupted from the southern edge of the city, where it still is today. So Brown Street you would think of as kind of the area with restaurants and bars and stuff around the University of Dayton, but then it basically stops. So now it veers off into Warren Street. And there's actually a tiny strip of Brown Street kind of right on the other side of 35. And then there's the strip in the Oregon District that only runs for a couple blocks. So this kind of shows that total transformation of the street grid by urban renewal. And you definitely can't travel that route anymore.
Yeah, it's certainly very different. Well, the corner there in the Oregon District of 5th and Wayne, that's considered a pretty nice spot today. You've got the corner kitchen on one corner, which just a quick plug, I did get to interview their manager on a previous episode. So I hope people check that out. But they're on one corner, and then the Dublin Pub is across from it. But it didn't used to have a great reputation. And I guess in your book, you talk about how it used to be known as Filth and Wine. So how did it get that nickname?
First of all, I'm really happy too that the corner kitchen is back open. Definitely a great spot. Yeah. And yeah, so that nickname Filth and Wine, as you say, really referred to the fact that the area had changed greatly from the earlier years that I'd been describing, and had become a really rough place. So you can trace those changes really all the way back to the Great Flood of 1913, where almost the entire neighborhood was underwater. And that caused not only destruction to properties and buildings, but also just caused some change in that many residents, especially the wealthier ones with many options, decided to flee to areas that were on higher ground. So they would be, out of that flood zone in case it happened again. At the time, this was areas like Oakwood that were developing, but also up in Dayton View, sort of in Northwest Dayton. Those areas were much higher and were very desirable and were developing very quickly with new housing. So that suburbanization really only would increase in the ensuing decades, of course, fueled by more and more automobile usage, and then eventually highways being constructed. So areas like the Oregon District, these inner city neighborhoods, many became neglected and blighted. So one source that I read kind of about specifically that area phrased it that the 5th Street Commercial District had changed from a mini downtown to a bunch of rough bars. So that's basically kind of what was there, at the time, and what would inspire that Filth and Wine nickname.
Gotcha. Well, continuing on with the Oregon District, not wanting to go the way of the Haymarket District. I know historical preservation societies popped up in the Oregon District and in St. Anne's Hill. Can you talk about those and how they were able to help save those neighborhoods from basically being demolished during that urban renewal process?
Yeah, this definitely is really just a fascinating story, and one that I think is responsible for managing to hold on to these most significant areas with the most history that we still have today. So originally, there were some plans to basically totally clear and redevelop everything basically from St. Anne's Hill to downtown. And one specific plan that was formed in the mid 1960s would have targeted the Oregon District and saved some structures, but would have demolished all of the rest and would have totally transformed the area. So after seeing so much of Dayton destroyed, like the Haymarket and the neighborhoods leveled for the highways, some people were starting to sort of fight back and realize they didn't want to keep losing more and more of the city. So the effort to save the Oregon District specifically from the start was really a grassroots effort. So it wasn't like a city initiative or funded by big sources of money. It was these early urban pioneers who were taking a chance on moving into an area that at the time was considered one of the worst part of Dayton, and then fixing up a house. And then someone else would, move in and do another down the street. And then that positive energy kind of radiated out and sort of created this spirit of preservation. And then, of course, organized efforts, as you mentioned, did play a big role too. So this kind of preservation was happening nationwide, and the Oregon District was the first Dayton neighborhood to be placed on the National Register of Historic Places in the 1970s, and then St. Anne's Hill was the second. So the Oregon Historic District Society and the St. Anne's Hill Historic Society were formed then, and they're still active today and are great resources for learning more about those areas. So I would encourage anyone interested in historic preservation and living in an urban neighborhood like that to reach out. One thing that's popular with a lot of these neighborhood groups is annual home tours that they often do. So you can get a chance to not only see the exterior but also go in some of these houses. So those are really cool ways to support groups like that. And then if you're also interested in preservation of the city more broadly and not necessarily just those two neighborhoods, there's another great group called Preservation Dayton, which is an organization doing a lot of great work to kind of stabilize and acquire, potentially do other things to save some properties and advocacy efforts, and working with property owners to kind of save some of these endangered relics of Dayton history, which are not only valuable for their past, but also, can be really great assets to our neighborhoods moving forward.
Absolutely. Well, your book is just full of amazing stories and pictures, and I'm sure it took you a while to research and write. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the places where you got your research materials from.
Well, definitely. So as a librarian, I hope I don't get too excited and start geeking out on research materials too much. But seriously, I do really enjoy that process of unearthing obscure facts and using all types of different research materials. So our local libraries are major sources. So Dayton Metro Library has great local history collections. Both books, but also their digital image collections have a lot of the historic photos, which I use in my book and other research. Wright State's Archives holds a lot of important collections, including those about the Oregon District preservation. So as I was researching that story of the 1970s, that's where all of the newspaper clippings and documents and manuscripts are located. So Wright State was a big source where I took several trips to their archives. As a Sinclair staff member, anyone who's affiliated with Sinclair is a member of Ohio Link, which is the statewide system. So through that, I would request books from all around the state. And when I was writing my book, I probably had a stack of 20 or more books on my desk at all times, because just many different Ohio libraries had different histories relating to Dayton and some of the companies and some of the urban renewal and neighborhoods that I was doing research in. And then one other really specific source that I want to mention is something called the Sanborn Maps, which is a collection of early maps that were created for actually fire insurance purposes, strangely enough. So they were made to kind of help fire insurance companies assess their liabilities in different cities, including Dayton. But the reason that's interesting to me and to other people interested in history is that they created maps at an extremely detailed level. So we're talking about an entire area, the exact street grid with every building there depicted, and there's little symbols on the map that show you everything from how many stories the building was to what materials it was made out of, if it was a brick or a wood frame building. So these maps that were created for a very specific purpose are actually one of the only things left to depict, really show you on a street, level of kind of feel of what these neighborhoods looked and felt like. So I use those heavily in my research, and it's another really good source that's out there.
That's so cool. Well, in addition to your book, you also have a website, DaytonVistas.com, which features stories about Dayton's past, present, and future. And one post I came across from a while back was about some of the other interesting places that aren't on Fifth Street, which is what everybody usually thinks of when they think of the Oregon District. So could you maybe talk a little bit about a few of those locations and what they used to be, used for?
Sure. So Oregon streets, other than Fifth, really do have a lot of interesting buildings, in not just homes, but also other types of structures. So I mentioned how before 35, Brown Street was a huge thoroughfare that just kept going, and other streets really were better connected to the surrounding areas, so you could have more there and have more people be in easy access to them. One building that I talked about in that article was Jay's Seafood Restaurant. So the building that houses Jay's today dates back to the middle of the 1800s, and it was a corn and grist mill. So that kind of goes back to talking about some of the industry that sprang up around the canal originally. And I think that building's also very cool because its current use, Jay's Restaurant, also dates way back to 1976. It was one of the first to open in that area. And that's back when it was a really big risk. No one would have thought that opening a nice restaurant in that neighborhood would be a good idea. It was similar to those urban pioneers who were just starting to fix up homes and move into, what was called a slum at the time. So that's a very cool one. Another of my favorites is the Urban Krag climbing gym. Is really what I would say is one of the coolest examples of adaptive reuse, not just in Dayton, but really in I would say even the Midwest. Its building is a former church called the Second Reformed Church, built in 1888. It was in the 1990s about to be demolished after being abandoned for over 30 years, but it was carefully renovated and restored and then converted into that climbing gym, which it still is today. So that's just a really cool example of kind of what we can do with some of these buildings if we're able to kind of stabilize and save them.
Absolutely. I've been in there before, and it's just such a cool use for the space. So I'm glad they've been able to find the uses for those. Well, it's been great talking with you, and I really hope to have you back on soon to talk about more Dayton history. But if people would like to purchase your book or learn more about you, where could they go?
Yeah, so you can just go to the website you mentioned, DaytonVistas.com. I've got some information about me and the book, so you can just send me a message through the website. If you're interested in purchasing the book, I do have some copies of my own. It is also for sale in most of the bookstores around town. But if you want a copy from me, I'm happy to sign it for you, and we can find a good way to get a book over to anyone interested. And I always love hearing from people about Dayton history or about specific, buildings or projects going on. So definitely feel free to reach out. And then Dayton Vistas, I do have a couple of social media communities, so you can follow on, Facebook or Instagram specifically. And then I also do an email newsletter where I share some of my newest articles. So can see all that just on DaytonVistas.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your wealth of knowledge about Dayton history. I appreciate it. And I hope you'll come back soon.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation, and I'd love to be back another time soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much. All right. That was my interview with Andrew Walsh, and I can't recommend his book enough, Lost Dayton. We're just skimming the surface in this episode of all the little hidden gems he has in his book, so I highly recommend checking that out, along with his website, DaytonVistas.com. Andrew will also be giving a free talk about his book tomorrow from 6:30 to 8 p.m. at the Washington Township Recplex for an event put on by Centerville, Washington History, so you should definitely attend. Thanks so much for listening, and if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review and share it with a friend. Take care, everyone, and stay funky, Dayton.